But there's an interesting story I'll tell you. There was the chairman of the House Banking Committee back in the 60s was a congressman from East Texas by the name of Wright Patman. And Wright Patman was a very serious critic of the Federal Reserve, and someone convinced him that the Federal Reserve, in fact, had the ability to print money. And so Wright Patman, to his credit, found the two leading monetary theorists of the time, except, or two of the three, Carl Brunner and Alan Meltzer. And he funded a lengthy study which he published to address the issue of whether under the Federal Reserve Acts the Fed could print money. Mm-hmm. And the publication is very valid. Carl was a mentor of mine, really a brilliant fellow, and I knew Alan quite well. Anyway, they concluded the Fed could not print money, that they could increase liabilities to whatever extent needed, mm-hmm. but that the money supply was, in the final analysis, determined by not only the Fed's balance sheet, the monetary base, but the money multiplier. Mm-hmm. And that the money multiplier is an endogenous variable. Endogenous means it's not controlled by the policymakers. And so the Fed can inject the reserves, but to utilize the reserves, the banks and their customers must be able to profitably employ the reserves. And what we're now learning is when economies become more and more indebted, the risk premium rises, the risk of default rises. And so it's more and more difficult for the banks to pass through all of their costs to their customers.
Right.
And so if you look at the economic textbooks, they will tell you the money multiplier should have been 10 because the reserve requirement was 10. And so they apply the binomial theorem, voila, a $1 increase in reserves leads to a $10 increase in money. Now they have eliminated the reserve requirements. That was one of the steps that they took. And in spite of that fact, the money multiplier is down to 3, and it's moving lower. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, it's going to continue to move lower because the Federal Reserve does not control little m. However, you circumvent the Brunner-Meltzer equation when you give the Federal Reserve when you make the Federal Reserve's liabilities legal tender. Because at that point in time, you meet the criterion of money. Money, and you can go to any major textbook you want, and all the minor ones too. Money has to have 3 criteria. It must be a medium of exchange. The Fed's liabilities are not medium of exchange. They sit on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Yep. They cannot be used to buy a football stadium or to pay salaries. It also must be a store of value. It's not a store of value. And it must be a unit of account. To be a unit of account, it must circulate freely. So the Fed's liabilities are not money. They can have an impact for a limited period of time, but ultimately it depends upon the interaction of the money multiplier and the Fed's balance sheet. But the analysis doesn't stop there because the money supply is not directly linked to GDP. Because there's also another intervening endogenous variable called the velocity of money.
Right.
And the velocity of money is outside the Fed's control. And what we're learning is that when Fisher in 1933 wrote that in highly indebted economies, the velocity of money falls. So what has been happening in the United States, Europe, Japan, China, as we become increasingly more indebted, the velocity of money is falling. And it's falling in line with the marginal revenue product of debt, which means the amount of GDP created per dollar of debt. And in other words, when the marginal revenue product of debt declines, it's confirmation that diminishing returns is at work.
Right.